Hello and welcome to today's edition of Consciousness Central, coming to you from Toward a Science of Consciousness Conference 2015 here at the University of Helsinki in beautiful Finland. Our next guest on Consciousness Central is Ariane Lambert-Mogiliansky. Ariane is a professor of behavioral economics at the Paris School of Economics, and she collaborates with some of the other scientists here, Paavo Pelkanen and Harald Atmansbacka. So welcome, Ariane, thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
And perhaps we can start by talking a little bit about your collaboration and what this quantum interactive group is all about.
So Quantum Interaction is a group that is trying to collect together scientists from different disciplines who are interested in applying the quantum formalism outside of quantum physics. So it's psychologists, like you've heard about Büssemeyer and many other in psychology, physicists who are interested in bringing it, like Harald Atmansbacka. You have also linguists, computer scientists like Peter Bruer, and we have philosophers like Paavo, and well, it's a group of very different, so pluridisciplinary group really. There is another economist actually in the UK, in the UK, but he also has physics background.
Right, so for you as an economist, when you were first sort of introduced to this idea that, perhaps quantum physics has some bearing on economics, how did you respond to that? What was that like?
So actually I started on my own in a sense. So within behavioral economics, what is behavioral economics to start with? So the standard model in economics produce predictions, and people do not follow those predictions. This is called behavioral anomalies. So there is a pretty wide range of it. There is even a Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics, Kahneman. And there are lots of different anomalies, and for nearly each anomaly, there has been a new theory built. And I found that this is kind of frustrating, that this is not a proper way of doing science. As soon as you see one phenomenon, of course it's slightly larger, it's a class of phenomena, but the class is very reduced. So we were thinking that actually many of those phenomena look like, not all of them of course, but look like phenomena of non-commutativity in decision making. That's one part. The second part is that we have in economics a theory called revealed preferences. Revealed preferences, that when you make a choice, you're revealing your preferences. What you can see that as when you're confronted with the choice situation is like someone or the situation is making a measurement. What is it you like, tea or coffee? It's a measurement made on your preference. Quantum mechanics is the theory of non-commuting measurements.
Yes.
So that's how we got into it, and it could indeed unify very many different, provide an explanation for very different kinds of anomaly, like cognitive dissonance, framing effect, preference reversal, the conjunction fallacy, which are viewed as totally different things by behavioral economists. So that was the main reason why we turned to it, to look at something more fundamental that can explain simultaneously many different things. At the same time, it's very I would say constrained, so it's not that you can explain anything, far from it. So I think it's a nice combination of greater explanatory power and at the same time a very rigorous theory and quite constraining.
And so you're saying that people from other disciplines are coming in as well, sort of?
Yeah, it's through connection, and now we have we're announcing when we make a conference, but it's very much through connection and through our publication. People are beginning to get interested. Not beginning, actually, these quantum ideas are like everything, That's an observation. Like when one interesting idea pops up in your mind, you can be sure that it has popped up in the mind of many people around the globe. Right. So take some time, but we get in touch with each other.
Excellent. So, is there a way to apply it in the real world, in practice? Can you take what you're learning and sort of find new models or revise models that you can then take and say, yes, okay, governments or policymakers and things like that?
Okay, so that was a question we had at the session. I think there is a stake in bringing in this quantum formalism in social sciences, because it very importantly, since, as I try to say today, it is consistent with the idea that there is no self. And all economics is kind of based on the maximization of your utility. But if you do not have a self, then you do not have one utility. All this idea of egoistic utility maximization is dissolved. It's not that you criticize bad or not bad, it's just that it has and I think that can make you think about interaction in society, that and the behavior of human beings and the way we want to organize society in a very different way. Yeah, I think the stake is very, because in today's world, economics is kind of a dominating way of thinking about things, and this has a kind of deleterious impact. People think they are rational utility maximizer, but they are not really comfortable with that. So if you can offer them another model, then they may feel that it's more in sync with the way they live their life and they feel. So that's...
I think it's notable that the quantum pioneers like Niels Bohr and Schrödinger and later David Bohm, Wolfgang Pauli, they all had a great interest in what you might call a metaphysical or spiritual approach to things as well. And certainly when you start to go into this sort of non-dual aspect of things, then
absolutely.
This self, the ego self can kind of start to melt away into this sort of larger self, which we find
so
in the
I
spiritual
certainly
tradition.
think that my own practice is what brought me in a way that I did not explicitly, but that I think that many people do not have an intuition for quantum physics. They say, like Feynman say, we don't understand it, it works, it's incredible, it works. When you practice, and so you have this other dimension of, then it makes sense. And so when it makes sense, you start to get intuition. And this intuition leads you in your research to what can be interesting, what is feasible. So yes, it is connected with that, definitely. And even in the Buddhist tradition, like you probably very well know, that Nagarjuna's logic, the logical text of his construct, is very close to quantum logic. So somewhere, yes, there is an absolute correspondence between the two, and this is nice too, because if we are to bring it to society through this, bring it to social sciences, that means that it opens up also that dimension for people. At least it becomes legitimate. It's not like completely different things. The material world and the other world, they are not separated in that way.
And with that, that's a beautiful place to finish. Thank you very much, Ariane, for talking this afternoon. That's really interesting. Thanks so much. So let's go and join Cameron Keyes at today's poster session.
Enjoying the poster session?
Oh, lovely.
excellent. And well, we're going to go check out a 7-year-old girl who has a poster here at TSC 2015.
Hang on.
Extraordinary.
I follow you.
Let's try it.
Yeah, try it.
So tell us what your name is and guide us through your poster for a little bit.
My name is Mukti Sahni. Paul Brunton had come to search secret India. He described Sir Sahabji Maharaj in the following words: master of over 100,000 people who practice a mysterious form of yoga, prime organizer of the multifarious and materialistic activities which seethe around me in Diyarbakh. Taken all in all, I write him down as a brilliant and breathtaking man. Nowhere in India, nowhere in the entire world may I expect to meet his like again. These poems are describing Diyarbakh and Diyarbakh life. This is DI distance education in India. This is Diyarbakh solar map. Increased levels of consciousness can be measured through MEC facility at Nano Center DEI. Diyarbakh, which means the Garden of Merciful, is an example of a successful and blissful eco-village. This is the holiest pilgrimage or the spiritual home for the followers of Radhaswami faith. It is a place where meditation can be practiced at the highest level to attain the ultimate truth of life.
My name is Josephine Anstey. My poster is about a performance. It's actually a performance lecture that is a spoof lecture of the history of human cognition and consciousness.
And you put a spoof lecture into a poster.
I put a spoof lecture into a poster.
So we start with some walrus-like creature of some sort, and guide me through. Is this the first one? And then it.
Well, in my history of human consciousness, it starts out with a pre-linguistic human intelligence and consciousness, where people walk through the landscape together, sharing attention, and create. They understand patterns in the world so that they can survive in the world. And so it's like human level intelligence, but pre-language. And then I go through, it's basically an attack on language as being a primary form of consciousness. And so later on we get to the bicameral mind, where your right brain, God's side of the brain, gives instructions to the left side of your brain, telling it how to behave. And then we get to the current consciousness, which is all formed by a narrative-based I structure. And my lecture goes into the future and suggests that we are not going to get into the future unless we get over the dominance of language in terms of consciousness, and we return to some of the visually based cognitive structures that have been suppressed by language.
Beautiful.
My name is Dave Liebman. I'm a management consultant from the US. A key idea about the poster is to focus on the application of much of the research that's going on at this conference. It's worthwhile to note that there are no, and I'm focusing on business as the #1 institution in the world today, affecting everything that people have to do. But it's interesting to note that, as far as I know, there are no business researchers here, no consulting to business researchers here, and there's quite a large industry of research and business. However, they never talk about the psychophysical aspect. They usually only talk about the technological or the competitive aspect.
So are you taking us back to the days of Napoleon Hill and the...
Not at all. Not at all. The reason being is that Napoleon Hill, while he may have been onto something intuitively, did not have any science backing him up. We now have tremendous amount of science, experimental data, as well as anecdotal data, as well as a collection of observations from people who've been in business, as well as people who have a psychological or human element background.
This is a really good point. Maybe in next year's conference we should have a workshop devoted to business applications of these ideas.
I think it would be a major step forward, and probably a little too late. However, never too late.
Okay, so my name is Pessi.
And we studied here how people notice faces which either look away or turn to look at you. And this is what we found, that faces that turn to look at you, people notice those more efficiently than those that turn to look away from you for either side. And we made 3 experiments and the results were the same for each one of those. But then we combined all the experiments of the data and then compared the gender differences there. And
So there are gender differences?
yeah, there's a huge gender difference in fact. So that for men, there's really not that much difference whether people look away or look at you. So the detection level is basically the same.
So
The difference is huge, like 15% or like that.
so in this sample, the women were a little more self-conscious, or what's the explanation for the?
Well, I don't know, maybe they're kind of more tuned to the social stimuli in the environment or something like that, more sensitive to eye contact or...
Do you think that this is that there's some variability if you went to a different country or some different culture? Or?
Yeah, maybe.
Where was the research taking place?
Well, these were all Finnish students. So if you go to Japan or China maybe, or I don't know, North America or somewhere else, it might kind of change the whole result, of course. But
That's fascinating, but really interesting. Thanks very much.
Our next guest is Peter Bruer. He is Professor of Science and Technology at the Queensland University of Technology. Obviously that is in Australia. And his field is computer science and quantum cognition. So Peter, let's start by asking you about this term quantum cognition. Perhaps you can tell us what that means.
Yeah, so quantum cognition was an area that was started by a guy called Diederik Arts, who was the pioneer. And really it revolves around taking essentially the formal structures of quantum theory and then trying to apply it to come to a better understanding of cognitive phenomena. In our case, we essentially interested in the modelling question. So to what degree the formal structures and formalisms of quantum theory can produce better models of cognitive phenomena than are currently available.
Do you have an example maybe of, what part of the formal structure of quantum theory would we be talking about? Or
yeah, okay,
so
our particular area has been looking at conceptual combinations. So when novel concepts come together, so for example, if I say boxer bat, right? So probably you've never heard these two concepts together, and then when you supply this to human subjects, and ask them to interpret it, they might think of a furry black animal with boxing gloves on, or they might think of a bat that a boxer uses for training, or they might think of a boxer dog that's using the bat as a toy, or you might even think of a Batman logo on boxer shorts. So, so the question has been, how is it that that humans can ascribe meanings to these novel concept combinations? And then there is a principle that has a well-established footprint in linguistics and also in formal semantics, which is called the principle of semantic compositionality. And this principle says, well, if we have a compound like, say, boxer bat, how we ascribe meaning to it is that we ascribe meaning to the parts and we combine them together to get the meaning of the whole. And so this has had a long tradition in sort of logical language and formal semantics of natural languages. But there has been some debate about whether language is compositional or not. And in particular with these conceptual combinations, there has been in the literature some sort of counter views that this is the case. Now, I guess that's a long-winded introduction to the problem, but you have a similar sort of thing in quantum theory where you have these systems of entangled photons. And the core component of that is that if when these two photons are in an entangled system, you can't understand it in terms of its constituent parts. So in that sense, it's non-compositional. So what we did was we thought, well, okay, if we wanted to come up with a very, very clear dividing line between whether a conceptual combination is compositional or not, we can use some of the same sort of probabilistic arguments that they use in quantum physics to decide whether a system of photons is entangled or not. And that's essentially what we did. So we run these experiments with human subjects. We ask them to interpret these combinations, and we use the same sort of theoretical results the physicists use in order to make a determination.
Right, and just to clarify, when you use the word compositional in this context, could you just define that for us for a second?
So compositional would mean that if you've got a combination like boxer bat, that you can understand its meaning by simply understanding the meaning of its constituent parts and how they combine together. Right. So that's what compositionality means in language.
So of course, part of the science of consciousness debate is whether consciousness itself is somehow a quantum effect, or it's primitive to the universe, that consciousness is not a local thing just appearing in a brain. It's something, it has a much more fundamental property. Do you find any point of intersection with what you're doing and that area of thinking?
Well, that's a really good question, because you could say that cognition is somehow hasn't got a clear relationship with consciousness. In fact, when I first, as a computer scientist, I started getting into cognitive science. It was a friend of mine, Simon, and I didn't know anything about cognitive science. And I remember asking him, I said, surely you must be trying to study consciousness, because that's the real big problem. And he said, no, it's too hard. And so even within cognitive science, the way they divide what cognition is, you've got memory, you've got how we make decisions. And even within memory, there's so many different competing views that this whole consciousness question just doesn't get a chance to surface. So I don't know. I really don't know the connection between what we do in terms of modelling cognitive phenomena with consciousness. This is still very, very vague to me. I guess the only thing I can say in that connection is that we know in sort of the memory experiments. So there's an experiment called extraless cueing, where in this experiment a subject is given a series of words that they study for a couple of seconds, say on a computer screen. They're not told anything just to study those words. They get a series of these words, and then after they've got the series, then they get a cue word, which isn't a member of the list, and they're asked to recall the first word that comes to mind from the study list. And what we know there is that when they're studying a word, that the word is, say you're studying the word planet, it activates in memory, but there are a lot of associations that we like Mars, Moon, etc. We know that below the surface these are being activated, but that would be more pre-consciously. It's not a conscious activation. Yeah. So unfortunately, I can't add too much to this cognition consciousness divide.
These some of these that get called by Dave Chalmers, easy problems, but of course, there's nothing easy about these problems. I mean, it's really, really hard. With your background in computer science, I mean, as you say, computing really there is a movement in the consciousness, one wing of the consciousness crowd is fairly sure that it's only a matter of time before we have a computer powerful enough that somehow you can integrate with human consciousness and perhaps sort of upload yourself into the system somehow. That, of course, would mean that consciousness itself is computational, and that plays into a big debate that's been going on in this conference. What's your thought on that? I mean, because
I don't subscribe to any of that. Because the one thing, I've come to this conference a couple of times now, and then I went to the one a couple of years ago in Dalbach, the Dalbach Institute. And then you just get this very, very broad spectrum about what consciousness could be. So you had anaesthetists talking about, well, trying to figure out how the drugs are turning the lights off, for example, and then you'd have someone from the Eastern perspective talking about cosmic consciousness. And the thing that really strikes me about consciousness is one of these things that's very, very hard to objectify. So, and in order to come up with a computational model of consciousness, you've got to objectify it. And I think consciousness has this curiosity that it resists objectification. So as soon as you objectify consciousness, it seems like it slipped through your fingers. That's this sort of. So it seems to me any of that won't have much prospect of success, and in fact I'd probably say is doomed to fail. So there's something quite very, very subtle about consciousness that. I'll be curious to see in 50 years of running this conference how far we got down the track.
Exactly, we're going to have to drop the empirical model, which is going to be very hard to do.
Yeah.
Because how do you do it otherwise? We can't write it down. Some people want to put it on a T-shirt like the formula, but it's not going to be that easy. It's why it was so ignored for so long by science. It's the sort of the greatest anomaly of all.
And this is a very, very intriguing. I don't know what it is to investigate.
Excellent. Peter, thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon. I think it's fascinating to take these areas, like whatever's being discovered in the quantum realm, and bringing it into these other realms and seeing how it all interacts. I think we learn more as time goes by from doing that. So great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That
Thank
is Peter Bruer. So once again, time to check in with our roving reporter, the intrepid Cameron Keyes, who's been sitting in on the plenaries today. Cameron, tell us what offerings we've had that might be scintillating.
So we had a plenary today and then a keynote by David Chalmers. The plenary was a group of philosophers talking about the complications with science of consciousness and some of the underpinning philosophical issues about causation and some basic philosophical categories. So they started with John Heil. John Heil is in a tradition that separates what he calls the manifest image and the scientific image of man. The manifest image is just ordinary consciousness, the sort of popular beliefs that we have about how the mind works, how the mind connects with the body, how the causation of it happens in the world. And so there's this tradition in philosophy, most notably by a guy named Wilfrid Sellars, that separates these two, the manifest image and the scientific image, and says that, some of our intuitions about how the world works turn out to, when you study them scientifically, they may be mistaken. But how do we really understand this separation between the internal life, the subjectivity? It's kind of the hard problem in a different way. And so John Heil is suggesting that he goes along with Baruch Spinoza, some of these ancient, early modern philosophers, and then some contemporary guys that say, there really is just a conceptual distinction between this manifest image and this scientific image. For Spinoza, there's just one substance, and then everything else is just modes and attributes of this substance. So he's saying, similarly, the separation between the mind and the body, these subjective feelings and these empirical facts, this is just a merely conceptual distinction. And if we really want a science of consciousness, we just have to accept that this is a very deep and somehow necessary conceptual distinction to make. And then we go on without really maybe requiring that we fully explain where subjectivity comes from, why it feels like something from the inside to be someone. And so he's saying, maybe it's a little more fruitful just to kind of allow these distinctions to be what they are. So then we had Alyssa Ney and David Papineau. These are very similar, they take very similar lines of thought, and so I'm going to just combine them here for purposes of discussion. Alyssa talked about how in quantum physics you don't actually have causation, you have time indeterminate laws and statistical laws. So where do we get causality from? So if the laws aren't causal, but in the macro-physical world we experience causation, how do we reconcile the micro-physical and the macro-physical? So she's suggesting that actually what we really need is a new sort of mode of, or philosophy of explanation that can that can find out a way to reconcile these things by, for example, saying, you know, every physical effect has a physical cause, but as long as you understand the history of that system somehow, then and the logical, you know, necessity of causation, then you can get some maybe satisfactory explanation for some of for causation. So and David Papineau similarly, they're groping for ways of reconciling quantum physics with the macrophysical world in philosophical terms. And David Papineau focused on statistical views of causation. So even though you have say a complete explanation of all of the microphysical properties of the world at the moment, but some of those things, statistically, a few of them will be here and there, and you'll get causation just as a probability distribution. So in any case, because this is they were philosophy lectures, and philosophy lectures are very difficult to understand. I can't be completely confident that I got everything, so I'll apologize to the viewers if I messed it up. But
sounded good to me, Cameron.
Yeah, but my understanding was that's what it was. Now, David Chalmers is the arch philosopher, but also has the profound ability to be very clear when he gives these lectures, and that's what makes him, I think, so popular. And so David told us about some work that he's been doing with a quantum physicist to try to reconcile this hard problem and to try to take a dualist approach where the mind is somehow irreducible, or consciousness is somehow an irreducible phenomena that we have to now insert into our quantum mechanics equations. So he introduced what he called the M operator, which is a sort of mental or consciousness operator that you can insert into these basic Schrodinger equations. And he just talked about how if you take the possibility of this M operator and a basic law that says anytime consciousness is involved in a physical system, that physical system is forced to collapse. You can't have a superposition of consciousness with the physical system, or a superposition of consciousness. So if you just take that basic idea and then run with it, he says that this could be a fruitful mode of inquiry for the next 50 or 100 years in consciousness studies. So he's really trying to build the field going forward, and I think the crowd really appreciated it. So.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. Hopefully we get to talk to Dave, if we can track him down on Consciousness Central. Cameron, once again, most excellent and concise summary of all this very, very fascinating stuff. Sounded like a really good day at the plenaries. And we'll catch up again with you tomorrow. Thanks again. That is Cameron Keyes. So that just about wraps it for another edition of Consciousness Central. We hope you've enjoyed today's program. Please join us again tomorrow for even more offerings from Toward a Science of Consciousness 2015 here in Helsinki. Bye for now.
Thank you.